So here you're talking about things that aren't even really the pursuit of self-interest by American elites, because they're not even based on strategic thinking.
Yes, I think the American elites have a lot to be held accountable for because they have failed their own populations. They haven't been able to create a social and political system that distributes the public goods to their own population and improve the lifestyles and lives of their own populations. But that's a failure of American elites. And that's why, and precisely because the masses, the 50% at the bottom, have not seen any improvement in their living standards, they have become a very angry population, and they wanted to vote for somebody who would give Washington, D.C. a big kick in the butt.
That exchange you just heard gets to the heart of one of the most central questions of our time. As the world's #1 power, what exactly has gone wrong with the United States? The speaker is Kishore Mahbubani, a former top diplomat from Singapore who spent decades navigating the UN Security Council and the world stage. His perspective is crucial because he is an expert in geopolitics, deeply rational, calm, and has a profound understanding of both the US and China. It is from this foundation that he offers a candid, almost brutal, diagnostic report for this superpower that is losing its way. In the content that follows, you will hear him systematically dissect why the chip war launched by the US ultimately backfired, why America's massive defense spending has instead become a geopolitical gift to China, and how the United States has repeatedly made disastrous decisions against its own interests on a series of major geopolitical issues, like the wars in Iraq and Libya. This is not just an in-depth analysis of America's strategic blunders, but also a profound reflection on what it truly takes for a great power to remain strong. Let's continue.
And there's no question that Donald Trump is clearly giving Washington, D.C. a big kick in the butt and saying, you guys have not taken care of the people of the United States. Now, of course, unfortunately, his belief that there's only one solution to all these problems, to increase tariffs on every country in the world, I fear is not the answer. And Economics 101 will tell you that when you impose tariffs, the cost of the tariffs will not be paid by the exporting country, will be paid by the consumer. And so American consumers are going to find in these coming months that life is going to be very difficult for them as a result of these tariffs. Of course, assuming that the suspension is removed. Of course, if they remain in place, then the tariffs won't do as much damage.
You pointed out that global economics is not a zero-sum game, and another theme that comes across in your writing is that essentially, if we are going to have a prosperous, a peaceful 21st century that deals with the major crises that we face, such as climate change, we are going to have a world that cooperates, a world of mutual respect, and a world where we are sort of capable of, where countries are capable of understanding one another. And in the rhetoric that you hear in the United States about, I mean, Donald Trump openly says China is our enemy. That's his quote. The rest of the world is ripping us off. It is really quite the opposite of the story that you're telling. I mean, you tell a story of us as all inhabiting one planet and a need to sort of work things out. In the United States, the Trumpian narrative is we inhabit a world of enemies. Those enemies need to be tamed or destroyed. We need to build up our ability to crush them militarily if necessary. So it would seem that much of the story told in the United States is really going in the opposite direction of the one that you feel generates the understanding necessary to live well in the 21st century.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. But I can fully understand why Donald Trump wants to try and improve the livelihoods of the bottom 50% of Americans. I think that's a noble goal that he has. I can understand why he wants to make American industries more competitive and reindustrialize America. That's also an understandable goal. But I think he will find that the best way to achieve those goals is actually to work with the rest of the world. And one thing I've learned after studying geopolitics for 55 years is that you got to be cold and calculating if you're going to succeed in geopolitics. And if you're emotional, then you're at a major disadvantage. So, for example, how did China become so wealthy so quickly? What they did was that it worked closely with the United States, even though technically, even during parts of the Cold War, the US was an adversary. China worked with the United States to grow its economy. And I think that's one thing that is taboo in the United States, that actually the best way for United States to regenerate its economic growth and make it grow faster is not to try and bring down China, but to work with China. Just as when at the time when you were worried about Japanese cars taking over United States, what do? You have voluntary export restraints. You encourage the Japanese to set up factories, Toyota factories, Nissan factories, Honda factories in the United States. The same thing can be done with China. It can only be done if you are rational and calculating in your moves and not emotional and say, oh no, we can never work with China. Why can't you work with China? If working with China is going to bring benefits to the American people, why not work with them? Because at the end of the day, it's very clear that all efforts to stop the rise of China by the United States are going to fail. And you cannot stop a 4,000-year-old civilization that has its own civilizational cycles. And as it is rising, just by depriving them of this technology or that technology is not going to stop the rise of China.
And you point out that for most of human history, the Chinese and Indian economies were among the largest in the world. They have the largest global population. And so to try and reverse the trend towards a more equal balance of power in the world, you argue, is futile.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fact that everyone should know, that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world have always been those of China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that Europe has taken off and North America has taken off. And the last 200 years of Western domination of world history have been a major historical aberration. And all aberrations come to a natural end. So it's perfectly natural to see the return of China and India. But what's important to emphasize is that the reason why China and India are coming back is that they are studying, absorbing, and implementing Western pillars of wisdom. And that's why they're succeeding. And paradoxically, at a time when, for example, China, a communist party-run country, is discovering the virtue of free trade agreements, and free trade agreements have enabled China to become one of the fastest growing economies in the world, the United States is walking away from free trade agreements. But this is where economics 101 theory is right. The United States should be signing more free trade agreements and not walking away from them.
Now, you mentioned there that China being a Communist Party-run country, but one of the points that you make in your book, Has China Won, is that one of the major misunderstandings of China comes from seeing it as an ideologically communist entity in the kind of classic Marxist-Leninist sense.
Well, I think, anybody who thinks that China is a communist country should go visit China. I mean that literally. Every American who believes that should go visit it. I have actually visited Moscow in 1976. And trust me, that place was so controlled, so oppressed. And when you went into the biggest department store in Moscow, right, and you wanted to buy a toothbrush, I'm not exaggerating. They had a huge cabinet, and you had one toothbrush separated from the other toothbrush by 1 foot. Even the toothbrushes were scarce commodities. No, and probably when a small 7-Eleven in the United States has more toothbrushes than a large department store in Moscow. Everything was scarce. Now you go to China today, and you will see the most advanced economy in the world in terms of how it produces both private goods and public goods. If you go and see the infrastructure of China, you begin to realize that after going from Kennedy Airport to Beijing Airport, you're going from a third world airport in the United States to a first world airport in China. And by the way, incidentally, also a first world airport in New Delhi and Mumbai. So there are areas in which Asia has surged ahead, clearly, of the United States, and the United States should consider the possibility that it could possibly try to emulate what the East Asian economies have done.
You point out, perhaps more controversially, that even on the question of personal freedoms, there are important ways in which China is certainly distinct from the Soviet Union. In fact, I believe in one of your books you cite going to the Soviet Union and the lavatory on the train. You're not allowed to use it because there's no law saying you can use the lavatory on the train. So whatever isn't permitted explicitly is forbidden. And you point out that even though China is not, you don't argue that China is in fact a democracy or that it doesn't have abuses of power or clearly a different system than the United States, but that we don't. But you point out that Chinese tourists travel all around the world in a way that Soviet tourists certainly didn't. So even there, we sort of misunderstand, and by not understanding that, we don't understand why a lot of people in China might actually think that they had good governance.
As I say, in the old Soviet Union, which I visited several times, by the way, not a single ordinary Soviet citizen was allowed to go on tourist holidays overseas, because they were afraid that any Soviet citizen who went out would defect and not return home to the Soviet Union. Now, what's amazing is that in the year 2019, before COVID came along, there were 139 million Chinese people left China freely to go overseas. And if communist China was a gulag that was oppressing its people, the 139 million people in China should never have come back. They should have said, hey, we will enjoy freedom overseas. But guess what? They all came back massively. And as you know, now even students graduating from American Ivy League are coming back. Professors teaching in Ivy League universities in America are coming back to China. And it's true that the Chinese political system is certainly not as free as the American political system. But at the same time, the Chinese also believe that in a good society, what the needs of the society are as important as individual liberties. So many Chinese are happy to accept restraints on social behavior because they believe that that's how you create a good society, and that's a different cultural assumption. Whereas in the United States, you believe the most important good is individual freedom, and any kind of social control is bad for the society. Now, but the Chinese are not saying that Americans should become like China. But what Americans and the West has got to understand is that in this new Asian 21st century, when the Asian societies come back, they're not going to become carbon copy replicas of liberal democratic societies. They're going to find their own balance, their own formulas for success. And it's good for the West to understand that in many ways, it may not necessarily be bad for the world if different societies and different civilizations make different choices to create good societies for their own people, which their own people are happy with.
Hi, sorry to interrupt, but if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel for more wonderful current
affairs material in the future, and head to currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine today.
My feeling certainly is that if we in the United States wish to make the case that liberal democracy with a very high value on individual personal liberty is the model for the good society, which I personally think it is. The way we could do that is by proving that it works in our own country, and then other countries might want to adopt it. But we don't, at the moment, do a very good job of making the case that a society with our kind of political system is going to end up terribly functional.
Yeah. And in fact, as you know, in my book, Has China Won?, I cite the works of Angus Deaton, who wrote a book called Deaths of Despair. And if you look at the data, this data is extremely sad about how the working classes in the United States are struggling and how their incomes are stagnating, how many of them are losing their medical benefits. And I think it's very important in a good society that you got to take care of people at the bottom 10%. I studied philosophy both in Singapore and in Canada at Dalhousie University. And one philosopher I studied was America's then greatest living philosopher, John Rawls. And in his book, A Theory of Justice, he emphasizes that the only way you can justify greater inequality, if as a result of the greater inequality, the bottom 10% are also better off and not just the top 10%. So that's what's missing in the United States, that the top 10% have seen their share of national income and wealth increase exponentially, but the bottom 10%, 20% have been stagnating. And that's something that can be fixed with good social policies.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier, because you mentioned the need. People might have been a little surprised to hear you talk of the virtues of being cold and calculating. And when you read your books, one of the things that one of your prescriptions is to become more Machiavellian. I think this is very interesting because people might be surprised to hear Machiavelli praised, staying on the subject of political philosophy. But one of the interesting things that comes out of your books, your analysis, is that actually, when the United States thinks it's doing cold, there's certainly no lack of callousness or coldness in a lot of American foreign policy or willingness to destroy the lives of others. But there is a certain absence of strategic thinking, and one of the things that you point out is that we mistake what real strategic thinking is. So, for example, you cite Sun Tzu saying, well, if you don't know your enemy as well as yourself, you're going to lose half your battles. And it seems like in the United States, we don't know either our enemy or ourselves. It might be considered non-strategic or sappy or excessively empathetic to try and understand China. But you say, no, understanding China, understanding how Putin thinks, these are not things you do out of an excess of emotion and sympathy. These are things you do because you are a strategic, careful thinker.
Absolutely. And it's a bit sad that the United States, when it launches geopolitical contests against China, decided to do so without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategic plan. And in an early chapter in my book, Has China Won?, I say there are 10 questions that anyone should ask if they're formulating a strategy. And I'm actually trying to help the United States formulate a comprehensive long-term strategy. Because if you don't have a comprehensive long-term strategy and you just carry out emotional actions, you end up hurting yourself. So, for example, the Biden administration thought they could stop the development of semiconductors in China by imposing all kinds of sanctions. And you can see the result. A few years later, China's share of the semiconductor market used to be 10%, now it's 50%. So all the efforts to stop China didn't work because no one thought strategically. And give you, just to make a very important point of detail, when the United States cut off supplies of advanced semiconductors uh, to China, it was cutting off his nose to spite his face, because by depriving yourself of 30% of your revenue, you lost all your R&D budget. And when you lost all your R&D budget, you lost your capacity to compete. So, you got to think strategically. When you carry on action, is it going to do more damage to my opponent, or is it going to do more damage to me? And I'm actually trying to help the United States work out policies that will be beneficial for the United States.
Yes, another example of this kind of paradox, where the thing that the United States does to counter China is actually helping China, not the United States, is you say rational and wasteful defense spending, which you say it is in this might surprise some people, that you say it's in China's national interest for American wasteful defense spending to continue. The more money America spends on weapon systems that will never be used against China, because, as you say, a war between the two countries would result in the destruction of both countries. You say that the better off China will be, and American military expenditures are geopolitical gifts to China. That is certainly something that those authorizing those expenditures don't believe.
Yeah. And you see, the tragedy here is that the way America spends money on defense expenditures, in theory, you should first work out a strategy and say, what kind of weapons do we need? And then you work backwards and say, okay, in this new strategic environment, maybe instead of piloted jets, we need pilotless jets, because drones today are as good as piloted jets. You spend so much money in an aircraft trying to protect the body of the pilot, but once you have a pilotless jet, everything is much cheaper, and you don't, and the planes can go faster. They don't have to worry about the human body in there. And similarly, today with advanced missiles, aircraft carriers have become sitting ducks. You no longer need aircraft carriers anymore to project power. But the reason why you cannot change course is because in America, and this is part of being a plutocracy, the arms industry can lobby the US Congress to pass bills to buy weapons that are outmoded and that are no longer needed. So America is producing a lot of weapons that will not be useful when the real war comes, because the aircraft carriers will be sitting ducks in the face of all these hypersonic and supersonic missiles that are being developed. But you have vested interest deciding what should be purchased. But if you do a zero-based thing, you can actually defend the United States much more effectively with half the budget or one quarter of the budget with much more effective weapons. But of course, the large part of the military industrial complex will complain, and then they'll go to Congress, and you won't be able to arrive at a rational decision. So in that sense, it is not China that is distorting your defense expenditures. It's the American political system that is preventing the United States from having rational defense policies.
We've been talking here about how the United States policy towards China is ultimately irrational and self-defeating and pseudo-Machiavellian, without actually thinking sensibly about what is in the interests of this country. But it's not the only example that you give of self-defeating Western policy. Just opening up your book here, Has the West Lost It? You'd say you have a section, Strategic Errors, Islam, Russia, and Meddling in World Affairs, and you make a series of arguments there that, for example, the United States treatment of Russia after the Cold War actually led to the rise of Putin, which was preventable, and that the United States, through its disastrous wars in the Middle East, has created, in many sense, or exacerbated the problems that supposedly we are trying to solve.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Iraq war was completely unnecessary. Completely unnecessary. I mean, you spend $3 trillion of blood and treasure, and at the end of the day, delivered a broken state in which it's not safe for Americans to live in. Right? And similarly, by the way, the removal of Gaddafi was a huge mistake, especially for the Europeans, because Gaddafi was acting like the cock in the bottle, preventing a surge of migrants from Africa towards Europe. But as soon as Gaddafi was removed, you know, the floodgates opened up. So it's not in their interest. So it's important to do a rational calculation of where your interests lie. And it's not in America's interest necessarily to fight forever wars and to have 800 military bases around the world. Because the United States is a very safe country. You're protected by two wonderful, huge oceans, and you're protected by Canada and Mexico. And you don't have hostile republics at your border. So you can actually cut down your defense expenditures dramatically. And instead of making it a sole American mission to keep international waterways safe, work with the other navies in the world and work cooperatively, because all of us share a common interest in keeping international sea lanes safe.
You know, you served as president of the. I mean, I believe you were in the UN Security Council in the lead up to the Iraq War. What
That's right,
like?
in 2001, 2002.
Yeah, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, you could see the tension building up in the Security Council, because the United States was trying to pass a resolution saying that to justify an invasion of Iraq. And it was very clear that Russia, China, and Germany and France thought it was a wrong decision. And frankly, if the United States had listened to its good friends, Germany and France, who said, you shouldn't fight this war, you will lose a lot of money and you will be worse off. The United States could have saved $3 trillion. And by the way, used it to develop the infrastructure of the United States and make it as gleaming as that of China. So why spend $3 trillion fighting an unnecessary war? And I'm surprised that no one has been held accountable for this unnecessary war. And I should also mention that I'm making these points because I actually believe that United States can become once again a very strong country. And the goal of all my prescriptions is not to weaken the United States, but to strengthen the United States and to make it a more effective actor in a complex world environment.
Yes, I think I see one part in your book on the West, where you say, some of my friends in other countries might wonder why I'm giving advice to America on how to become stronger, but I genuinely, want all of the countries in the world to reach their potential, and you come as a friend, and you say this over and over in the book. You go, I'm not criticizing. I'm not here to just list the flaws and follies of the United States. I'm pointing out ways in which this country is hurting itself.
Yeah. So my goal is to help the United States become stronger and more effective.
In this incredibly informative and deep analysis, Professor Mahbubani has systematically dissected the current predicament facing the United States. Let's quickly review a few of the core diagnoses he offered. Internal malady, plutocracy. He points out bluntly that the root of the problem lies in the American political system being hijacked by a plutocracy and the military-industrial complex, leading to public policy that no longer serves the majority and defense spending that is both wasteful and irrational. External blunders, a lack of strategic thinking. He argues that in its competition with China and in launching wars like those in Iraq and Libya, the United States has shown a pattern of emotional, short-sighted decision-making, ultimately leading to a series of disastrous, self-defeating outcomes. The core prescription, a return to rationality and cooperation. He repeatedly emphasizes that geopolitics is cold and calculating. He argues the U.S. needs to abandon emotional zero-sum thinking, return to rationality, and work with the world, including China, to truly solve its own problems and become strong again. Professor Mahbubani's diagnostic report also leaves us with several thought-provoking questions. First, to what extent do a nation's internal structural problems, like wealth inequality and political polarization, affect the rationality and effectiveness of its foreign policy? Second, when analyzing great power competition, should we focus more on their professed values or on the cold, hard national interests that lie beneath? And third, and most critically, for the United States, does the real threat come from an external challenger or from its own dysfunctional internal system? We are eager to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe this diagnostic report has provided a valuable perspective for understanding our world today, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.